She was 28, and her brother had taken the farm. Not openly. Thomas was too careful for that. He had taken it in the language of family feeling and legal confusion, in the soft phrases that men use when they want a thing done without the appearance of wanting it. There had been a will. There was always a will. But Thomas had sat across the table from Mr. Finch, their father's solicitor, and explained, with the patient sorrow of an eldest son who finds himself burdened by circumstance, that their father had revised his intentions in the final weeks, had said, more than once, that the farm should stay in the male line, that Clara would be provided for in other ways, that the document Mr. Finch held was not, in Thomas's understanding, the most recent expression of their father's wishes. Mr. Finch was 63 and had known George Holt for 40 years, and he looked at Thomas across the table with the expression of a man who understood exactly what was happening and had decided, for reasons Clara would later spend considerable time thinking about, that it was not his place to stop it. The will that Mr. Finch held left the farm, Holt's farm, 200 acres of West Yorkshire limestone upland, the farmhouse, the outbuildings, the grazing rights on the moor above, to Clara Elizabeth Holt, absolutely, in recognition of her 10 years of managing the household and the accounts and the daily work of a farm whose owner had been in declining health since her mother died. It was dated 8 months before George Holt's death. It was signed and witnessed. Thomas's objection was not to the will's validity. His objection was to its contents, and he prosecuted that objection with the quiet, steady persistence of a man who has decided that the difference between what the law says and what he intends to have is simply a matter of pressure applied in the right places over sufficient time. Clara had not expected this. She had known Thomas was not generous. He had left the farm at 19 and gone to Bradford, to a counting house, and had come back for their father's funeral with a new coat and the manner of a man who had been living among people who did things correctly. She had known he would not simply accept the will without comment, but she had not expected the particular form his opposition took, not a legal challenge, which could be answered, but a campaign of attrition conducted through the solicitor's office, through the family's neighbors and creditors, through the quiet withdrawal of the cooperation that a farm requires to function. By the end of the first month, the laborer who had worked the farm for 6 years had been quietly engaged by Thomas at a higher wage to work a neighboring property. The grain merchant who had taken the Holt harvest for 15 years sent a letter saying he would be unable to continue the arrangement. The bank, where George Holt had kept an account in his own name, required documentation Clara could not immediately produce to transfer the account to her own. Thomas had not touched the will. He had simply removed one by one the conditions that made the farm operable. And then he had come to the farmhouse 3 weeks after the funeral on a Tuesday morning and made her an offer. He would take the farm, assume the debts, manage the sale of the livestock, and give her £200, which was generous, he said, considerably more than a fair assessment of her share. She could stay in the farmhouse until the spring, when the sale would complete. Clara had looked at her brother across the kitchen table where she had kept accounts for 10 years, and she had said she would think about it. She had not said no, because she did not yet have the resources to say no. She said she would think about it, because thinking about it bought her time, and time was what she needed. She had been born in this farmhouse. She had watched her mother die in the bedroom above the kitchen, and her father decline for 6 years after, and she had kept the farm going through both of those things with the practical, unacknowledged competence of a woman who has no one to hand the work to. She knew every field by name and drainage, and what it would carry in a wet year versus a dry one. She knew the roof line and where it leaked, and what it would cost to repair it. She knew the grazing rights and the boundaries and the neighbors, fence that had encroached 3 feet into the north pasture in 1867 and that George Holt had been meaning to address before his health made it impossible. She knew the farm, the way a person knows the thing they have spent 10 years keeping alive, And she knew her father. She knew that George Holt, who had taught her to read a map and check a boundary and never sign a document she had not read to the bottom, was not a man who left things to chance where his land was concerned. The will was clear and correctly drawn, but her father had also watched Thomas for 50 years, and he had known Thomas long before Clara had understood what Thomas was. On the Wednesday after Thomas's offer, Clara walked out to the old barn. It stood at the north end of the yard, away from the farmhouse and the working buildings, a structure of the previous century that George Holt had not used in 20 years. Its function had been superseded by the newer implement shed nearer the house. The old barn held only broken equipment, rusted iron, the detritus of farming generations that had not been worth keeping, but had not been worth disposing of either. Thomas had mentioned it specifically in his offer. The barn could come down, he said. The stone was worth something. He would have it demolished in the spring. Clara had noted, without remarking on it, that Thomas had mentioned the barn. Thomas did not know farming. He had no particular reason to think about a derelict building that contained nothing but scrap iron and old straw. And yet he had mentioned it. She crossed the yard and pushed the barn door open and stood in the entrance, letting her eyes adjust. The interior was dim and cold, the roof sound enough above, but the light entering only through gaps in the stone where the mortar had gone. She walked the barn slowly, as she had learned to walk any space she needed to understand. From the entrance, along the left wall, across the back, along the right, to the center. The floor was earth and stone, large flat stones laid as paving in the original construction, some cracked, some settled unevenly. She walked each stone, feeling the ground through her boots. At the center of the barn, where the main roof beam crossed overhead, she stopped. One of the stones here did not sound the same as the others. She had spent 10 years walking floors, farmhouse flagstones, dairy tiles, the packed earth of the stable. She knew what solid ground sounded like underfoot, and she knew what it sounded like when it was not. The stone at the center of the barn had a quality she could not name precisely, but could not ignore. A faint hollowness under her boot, the suggestion of space beneath. She went back to the farmhouse and took from the tool cupboard a small iron mallet her father had used for fence pins. She returned to the barn and tapped the stone at the center, then the stones around it. The difference was not dramatic, a half-tone shift, the sound of a drum rather than a block, but it was consistent, and it was real. She worked the mallet around the edges of the central stone and found, under a crust of compacted earth, a seam, running around all four sides of a stone approximately 3 feet square, a gap that had been filled with a compound that had hardened over time into something resembling the surrounding material, but was not quite the same. She worked at it with the mallet's edge, and it came away in pieces. The stone lifted on the third attempt, using a fence bar as a lever. It was thicker than the surrounding flags. The underside faced smooth, the work of someone who had fitted it to sit flush, while concealing what was below. Beneath it a space, not large, perhaps 4 feet deep, the walls lined in fitted limestone, the floor below dry and clean. And in the space, a wooden box. The box was of oak, dovetailed at the corners, without lock or latch. She lifted it out and set it on the barn floor and sat beside it. Her hands were dirty from the stone, and she wiped them on her skirt before she opened the lid. Inside, a layer of oilcloth. She unwrapped it carefully. Below the oilcloth, 3 items. A folded document tied with brown string. A smaller envelope, sealed, with her name on the front in her father's hand. And a slim leather notebook, its cover worn smooth. She opened the envelope first. The letter was 2 pages in her father's handwriting, steadier than it had been in the last year, which meant he had written it some time before. He was not a man who wrote easily, and the effort showed in the density of the sentences, each one carrying more than it seemed to need to. Clara, if you have found this, then Thomas has done what I expected him to do, and you have done what I hoped you would do. I am sorry the farm has come to this. I built it for you. You know that. The document in this box is the original conveyance of the farm, the title deed to Holt's Farm in its entirety, made out in your name, registered with the County Land Office in Skipton in September of last year. I did not tell you, because I did not want you to have to keep a secret from Thomas, and I did not want Thomas to know until it was too late for him to interfere with the registration. The registration is complete. The farm is yours in law regardless of any will. The will Mr. Finch holds was a decoy. I am sorry for the deception. I wrote it with him knowing Thomas would contest the will if he thought it was the real instrument, and that while he was contesting the will, the registration would be invisible to him. I have been watching Thomas since he was a boy, and I know how he fights. He fights what he can see. The notebook contains the accounts of the farm for the past 30 years. Every transaction, every debt, every improvement. It is the record of what you have built here as much as what I built before you. If you need it for any legal purpose, it is accurate and complete. Go to a solicitor in Skipton. Not Finch, someone Thomas has not met. Your father Clara read the letter twice. Then she sat in the cold barn with the oilcloth on her lap and her father's handwriting before her, and was quiet for a long time. He had known. He had watched Thomas arrange himself in the months before the funeral, the visits to Finch's office, the conversations with neighbors, the careful positioning, and he had understood what was coming, and he had built around it with the same patient, methodical attention he had given to everything else on this farm for 50 years. The will was a decoy. The registration was the instrument, and he had hidden both the evidence and the explanation in the one place Thomas had no reason to look, and in the one place Clara had reason to walk to. She thought about Thomas mentioning the barn. He had mentioned it because he did not know what was in it, had mentioned it as the kind of thing a man mentions when he is accounting for every outbuilding, making sure nothing has been overlooked. He had not known to look in it. Their father had known that he would not know. She unwrapped the conveyance document. It was formal, correct. The registration stamp of the Skipton Land Office in the upper right corner. The date of registration, 14th of September, 1871, clear and unambiguous. The property described was Holt's Farm, 200 acres, farmhouse and outbuildings, grazing rights. The owner named was Clara Elizabeth Holt. She opened the leather notebook. 30 years of accounts in her father's hand, and the last 10 years increasingly supplemented by her own. The same ledger, 2 handwritings, the farm's entire financial history in 1 volume. She wrapped everything back in the oilcloth and put it in the box and carried the box to the farmhouse. She set it on the kitchen table. She made tea. She sat at the table where she had kept accounts for 10 years and drank her tea and thought about what to do first. The answer was the same as it always was. First things first. In order: first, the Skipton solicitor. Second, the land registry confirmation. Third, Thomas. She went to Skipton the following morning on the early coach, carrying the box in a canvas bag over her shoulder. She found the solicitor's office she was looking for, Hartley and Cross, on the Market Square, a firm her father had mentioned, once as being reliable and unconnected, to Finch's network, and she went inside and asked to see Mr. Hartley. Mr. Hartley was a man of 50, with the careful manner of someone who had spent his career in a market town, understanding the difference between what people said they wanted and what they actually needed. He read the conveyance document. He read her father's letter. He examined the registration stamp. He asked her 3 questions: the date of registration, whether she had the original will that Mr. Finch held, and whether Thomas had yet made any legal filing against the will. She answered the first and third. She did not have the will, but could obtain it from Finch's office. Mr. Hartley said that the position was straightforward. The registration of the conveyance in September 1871, correctly executed and stamped by the Skipton Land Office, gave her title to the property that was prior to and independent of any will. Thomas's contest of the will was legally irrelevant. The will had never been the operative instrument. The farm was registered in her name, and the registration had the force of law. He said he would write to Mr. Finch that afternoon advising him of the registration and requesting that he cease any actions premised on the will being the governing document. He would also write to Thomas. Clara paid his retainer from the farm's account. The account that was, she now confirmed with the bank on her way back to the coach, in her name and accessible to her, with the conveyance as documentation. She paid without counting the coins twice, which was how she had always paid for things she was certain of. Thomas's response, when Mr. Hartley's letter reached him in Bradford, took 4 days. His response was not what Clara had expected. She had expected anger. Thomas expressed himself in anger when he was certain, in cold politeness when he was not. What arrived at Mr. Hartley's office was cold politeness. A letter from Thomas's own solicitor, a Bradford firm, noting that Thomas was reviewing his position and would respond in due course, and requesting certain documents pertaining to the September registration. Mr. Hartley produced the documents. They were complete and correct. The Bradford solicitor reviewed them and took, Clara could only assume, the same 3 days that Mr. Hartley had taken to arrive at the same conclusion. The registration was valid, the conveyance was sound, and there was nothing in the chain of title that could be challenged. Thomas did not write to Clara directly. He never did. The communication was entirely through solicitors, conducted in the formal language of property law, and Clara read each letter that Mr. Hartley sent her with the same careful attention she gave to anything written about the farm that was hers. After 3 weeks of correspondence, the Bradford solicitor wrote to propose a meeting. Clara attended with Mr. Hartley. Thomas attended with his solicitor. They sat in Mr. Hartley's office in Skipton on a grey November morning, and the Bradford solicitor outlined, in the careful language of a man who has been asked to negotiate a position he knows cannot be defended, what Thomas was prepared to offer. Thomas, his solicitor, said, acknowledged the validity of the September registration. Thomas wished to propose, however, that the farm be sold and the proceeds divided, 60% to Clara, 40% to Thomas, in recognition of Thomas's position as the eldest child, and his understanding that their father had always intended the family to benefit equally from the property. Clara looked at Thomas across the table. He did not meet her eyes. She said through Mr. Hartley, no, Thomas's solicitor proposed 55 and 45. Clara, through Mr. Hartley, no, Thomas's solicitor said that Thomas was prepared to accept Clara's continued ownership of the farm on the condition that she buy out his notional interest, which he valued at £150, within 5 years. Mr. Hartley looked at Clara. She shook her head. Slightly, she said in her own voice, which she had not used in the meeting until this point. The farm is mine. It was registered in my name by my father in September of last year. There is no notional interest to buy out. Thomas has no claim on this property, and I will not pay for the absence of a claim. Thomas finally looked at her. His expression was the expression of a man who has understood, perhaps for the first time, that his sister is not the person he thought she was. It was not a comfortable expression to be the cause of. Clara found that she did not mind. The meeting ended without resolution on Thomas's side, which was itself a resolution. Mr. Hartley wrote to the Bradford firm confirming Clara's position. The farm was hers, unencumbered, and she had no intention of selling, dividing, or compensating anyone for anything. Further correspondence on the matter should be directed to his office. The Bradford firm wrote twice more over the following month, each letter slightly less confident than the last. Then there was silence. Clara did not hear from Thomas directly for 11 months. When he wrote, it was a short letter, formal, saying that he had taken a position in Leeds and wished her well with the farm. She wrote back briefly, thanking him for his good wishes. She did not mention the barn or the box or the letter their father had left in the stone beneath the floor. Some things are better kept in the family. The farm she ran as she had always run it. The laborer who had left came back in the spring, having found the neighboring work less congenial than expected, and she rehired him at the rate he had been paid before, not the rate Thomas had offered, because the rate Thomas had offered was not one the farm's accounts supported, and Clara ran accounts that the farm could support. The grain merchant she did not go back to. She found a better arrangement in Skipton, through a contact Mr. Hartley had suggested, at a rate that reflected what the Holt harvest was actually worth. The north pasture fence she addressed in April. She measured the encroachment, 3 feet, as her father had noted, and she spoke to the neighbor, a man named Archer, who had bought the adjacent land 3 years before and had perhaps not known the history of the fence line. She showed him the boundary in the old survey. He was a reasonable man. The fence was moved in a day. By midsummer the farm was running as it had run when her father was well, and rather better in some particulars, because Clara had 10 years of observations about what could be improved and was now in a position to act on them. She drained the lower field in August, which her father had always intended and never gotten to, using a method she had read about in an agricultural journal and adapted to the specific clay composition of the Holt soil. The field produced a third more the following year. The box she kept in the kitchen. The oilcloth-wrapped contents she transferred to the writing case her mother had left her. The conveyance, her father's letter, the leather notebook. The notebook she continued. She added her own handwriting to the pages where his stopped, the same ledger, the record of the same farm in 2 hands. On an October evening, she sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open before her and looked at the page where her writing began. September 1871. The month the farm was registered in her name. The month her father had gone to Skipton, while Clara was managing the harvest, and had come back with the document that settled everything, and had said nothing, and had put the box in the ground and waited. He had not known precisely when he would die. He had known that Thomas would move when he did, and he had known Clara would not immediately understand the shape of what Thomas was doing, and he had known that she would eventually go to the barn. Because she went to every building on the farm. She always had. It was how she knew the farm. He had known her that well. She closed the notebook and set it beside the writing case and looked at the kitchen for a moment. The range, the window above the sink, the door to the yard, the flags on the floor she had walked every morning for 28 years. The farm was quiet in October, the livestock settled, the fields done for the year. Outside, the moor above the north pasture had gone to its autumn brown, and the limestone walls ran up through it in the fading light, straight and exact, the way her father had built them. She put out the lamp and went to bed in the farmhouse that was hers.